Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, and I'm taking care of business. Joining me today is Jennifer Barrows-Hofer, who is head of marketing for Twitter Canada. Thanks for joining us today, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're going to talk about trends, trends that we are seeing and will be seeing continuing into 2022 on Twitter and on social media. Let's go by the top three. Let's go by subject by subject. The first one, big conversation piece that Twitter has identified is the Great Restoration. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've really seen a shift in how people have been talking about the environment on Twitter. And I think that's really because with the dawn of the pandemic, people have really shifted their perspective. So it's this idea that planetary and personal health are really intertwined. So in the past, conversations around environmental issues were really focused on recycling or plastic bags and straws, whereas now people are shifting. So they're putting a lot of the onus back on corporations and business. And so you're seeing conversations around deforestation, net zero emissions. And then from a wellness perspective, people are really, I know you've heard of the Great Resignation that has become, a real trend during the pandemic. And so that is really what we're seeing is people are questioning how they work, their relationship to nature and personal wellness. So when you think about if you're burnt out, we're seeing that people are really turning to nature to try to to counter some of the effects of burnout. But when you do that, you realize, oh, our environment needs help too. And so it's this idea of people pushing for, that sort of idea of corporations stepping in and helping to, increase the green spaces, build some of that in the community. And we're particularly seeing that among Gen Zers and millennials, to the point where we're seeing conversations around nature photography really taking off, people appreciating that, but also doctors prescribing visits to national parks to help combat burnout.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny because I recently did a story on that in particular, where doctors are making those prescriptions to being out in nature. And I know for myself, just personally, I know that taking pictures outside and just posting them on social media or on Twitter, like people always love seeing that.
Of course. Yeah, 100%, 100%. It's this idea of appreciation for nature and understanding that it actually helps us personally.
Yeah, you bet. Second conversation piece and trend, fan-built worlds. What does that mean?
This is really interesting. It's sort of this shift around how people are interacting with brands and artists that they sort of admire. And so it's this idea of the wall between idol and fan coming away and coming down. And so what we've seen over the past year is 2 times tweet replies in the fandom space year over year. So it's not just about standing back and watching, but collaborating, being part of communities and creating their own worlds in a way where people earn even tokens as a way to sort of, also increase their wealth as well in terms of how they're collaborating. And so it's really interesting because we're even finding in the sports fandom world, this is really taking off, where we're seeing teams like the Winnipeg Jets or the Montreal Canadiens that are offering NFTs and tokens to fans so that they can become part of the community. And so you even see that these communities, as they build sort of NFTs and tokens within these communities, they get a say in certain launches, or they get a say in certain decisions in the brand, so that they are part of the decisions and part of the community, as opposed to standing back and watching.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that trend is just going to continue to grow even more so?
I really do. And I think, it's really interesting because I just actually read an article today about, I don't know if you've heard of Trinny London, this beauty brand out of the UK. And what they saw was a Trinny tribe of fan followers of the brand. They sort of built themselves. And now the brand is participating in that and giving that fan group additional sort of member benefits. So one of the things that we saw and sort of what we're telling brands, it's like, understand that you now are not the only quote unquote owners of your brand, that you should embrace this idea that your fans and your customers want to be part of it. And you should encourage those communities and maybe even help create some of those communities.
Oh, cool. Third trend, finance goes social. What is
Social.
that?
Oh yeah, this is also really interesting. What we used to see in the past, this idea of sort of finance, Twitter used to be very exclusive, very technical, really much around people who were in that space. Whereas now what we're seeing, because a lot of the younger generation, if you think about it, older generations built their wealth through real estate, buying property. That is now not always possible for some of these younger generations. So they're starting to build wealth through things like NFTs or, things like virtual sneakers. And so you're finding that this conversation around finance among non-professionals is up 173% year over year. We're finding that, it's very significant. And this idea of decentralized finance and making this a much open conversation where anyone can participate is really taken off. And obviously part of that is tied to crypto and things like Bitcoin, but it's also just this idea that anyone can be part of this conversation because they're opening up sort of the ability to participate and be part of that type of investing going forward.
Why do you think that's becoming more important out there?
I think it's because, again, this idea that people want more control, right? And I think, it's like they want to be able to build their wealth in ways that appeal to them that maybe aren't tied to the traditional banks anymore. And I think part of it too is it's actually fun. And what we're finding is that along with these conversations, the use of emojis has increased 80%. So who would have thought that you see emojis around the finance conversation?
Yeah,
But
finance.
that's actually right around finance. But that's actually happening because, people are just, figuring out new ways to do this. And I think, even things like, and I think what's really interesting for brands is thinking about how do you participate in some of these virtual sort of brand launches where we're seeing virtual sneakers launching, on social, but then you can actually get them in real life. If you've got enough NFTs or tokens, you can go out and sort of think about how real world and virtual world are sort of intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Just in a general sense, Jennifer, the use of Twitter, can you talk a little bit about the growth of the use of Twitter over the years?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We've been seeing year over year growth in terms of, our daily users. I think in particular, what's been interesting to see is during COVID and with the pandemic, people really turned to Twitter, to actually connect with their communities and to understand and get information about what was happening. I mean, we saw in 2020 and 2021, the growth of vaccine hunters, for example, on Twitter. There, we saw this group, all of a sudden generate this like massive awareness and growth just to help people, figure out how do you get vaccines. And I think that's what's been really interesting to see. And when you think about these trends, it's when we thought about the trends and thought about what were the three that were going to be, going forward, it was not just about what people are talking about right now, but you start to see on Twitter the seeds of things that are, yes, they're talking about right now, but there's also this opportunity for growth. Where are people going? And I always think about it in a way as Twitter in a way is almost like the world's biggest focus group, right? If you think about, right? Like if you think about, do you understand what's happening there and human behavior? Because at the end of the day, people tweet about what they care about.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. Yeah.
You know what? It's funny you mentioned that because just as an aside and a personal note, as a journalist, I've often, I do a lot of media training type sessions with companies, et cetera. And one of the things that I do talk about is how, people ask, where do you find your stories, et cetera, right? And as a journalist, that's one of the things that I turn to is something like a Twitter, because first of all, it can give me leads on stories and story ideas just by what the conversation is. But it also, it also shows me that okay, this topic is trending, or this topic is important to a lot of people. So maybe we should do a story on this topic, right? So I think you're right in terms of like the focus group. It really shows that what people are interested in these days, right?
100%. I mean, we often refer to it. It's like the conversation layer of the internet. Like you're sort of in a way you're tuning in to think about like what are people talking about, and it as you said, it goes back to what people care about, which is really important.
Yeah, super. Well, thanks very much, Jennifer, for
Yeah.
joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
All right, super. That was Jennifer Barrows Hofer, who is head of marketing for Twitter Canada. I'm Mario Toneguzzi. This has been Taking Care of Business. Thanks for joining us today.